The sun hung low over the dusty horizon, burning the edges of the town in a harsh golden glow. Wooden storefronts leaned slightly with age, the clapboard walls warped from years of sun and wind. A tumbleweed rolled lazily across the main street, whispering secrets of the desert into the dry air. In the shadow of the town saloon, a crowd had gathered, murmuring with anticipation. It was a Sunday, and the air smelled of sweat, leather, and the faint tang of horse dung. At the center of the commotion stood the Thompson family, a once proud household now crumbling under the weight of debt. Their ranch lay miles beyond, a patchwork of faded fences and wilting crops, threatened by drought and taxes they could not pay. Their hands shook with worry as they clutched ledgers, coins, and scraps of hope. And now, desperate and broken, they had resorted to the unimaginable, gambling away their only daughter to save the land they loved more than life itself. Margaret stood a few feet away, her slender frame taut with fear. Her brown hair, loose and slightly tangled, fell around her shoulders like a curtain she wished she could hide behind. Her dress, once neatly pressed, had frayed at the edges from days of traveling and chores. The townsfolk's whispers scratched at her ears, cruel and indifferent. Abandoned woman, a gamble, poor girl. Her stomach twisted as her father avoided her gaze, his jaw tight and unyielding. Her mother's face was pale, drawn in lines of worry and guilt, and her younger brothers and sister huddled together, wide-eyed and trembling. "You'll do as you're told, Margaret," her mother whispered, her voice trembling, "and pray he is merciful." But mercy was a luxury no one could afford in the West. Margaret's heart pounded as she realized the truth. Her life was no longer her own. The auctioneer, a thin man with a sun-beaten hat and a voice that cracked like dry timber, called out. Going once, going twice, he looked down at the modest pile of coins laid before him, then up at the crowd. "Sold, to the highest bidder. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the property of Colton Briggs." A hush fell over the street. The name carried weight, whispered in awe and fear. Colton Briggs was known across the county as a man of imposing stature, a cowboy whose reputation was carved into the land he owned. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a jaw like chiseled stone and eyes that seemed to pierce through the dust and grit of the world. He rode into the town on a black stallion that gleamed in the dying sun, and the townsfolk instinctively stepped back. His hat was low, shadowing most of his face, but his eyes glinted with a keen awareness of everything around him. Margaret's heart lodged in her throat. She had imagined many things about being taken from her family, but this raw, immovable presence was not among them. The crowd parted as Colton dismounted with a fluid, practiced ease. The leather of his boots creaked against the wooden planks of the street, a sound that seemed to echo in Margaret's chest. "You're coming with me," Colton said, his voice deep, rough like gravel yet carrying an undercurrent of authority that brooked no argument. He gestured to the wagon waiting nearby. Margaret's legs shook, but she obeyed, her hands clutching a small bundle of personal belongings, a worn journal, a faded handkerchief, and a comb she had treasured since childhood. The ride to the ranch was long, and the land stretched in rolling hills and scrubland under a coppery sky. Margaret's mind raced. She tried to memorize every tree, every rocky outcrop, perhaps in the hope that if she survived this, she could one day return to the life that had been stolen from her. Colton rode ahead, silent, occasionally glancing back. His face betrayed nothing, but there was a measured, almost calculating gaze in his eyes, as though he were sizing her up like a horse or a stubborn mule. The ranch itself was rugged but well-maintained, a testament to the strength of the man who owned it. Horses grazed in the paddocks, and the faint smell of hay and manure mingled with the evening air. The barn was large, its door scarred with use. The house, a sturdy wooden structure with a wraparound porch, looked welcoming to some, but Margaret only saw work, labor, and servitude. Colton's first words upon arrival were not kind. "You start with the animals. Feed them, clean their stalls, and don't think about sitting down until the sun's gone." There was no malice, but no room for mercy either. Margaret's throat tightened. Her fingers trembled as she stepped forward to the barn, her body aching already from the long ride and the fear that had never left her side. The first days were brutal. Margaret's hands blistered from shoveling hay and muck. She carried buckets of water heavy enough to make her arms shake. She scrubbed floors until her knuckles were raw, planted seedlings under the unforgiving sun, and tended the garden with fingers blistered and dirty. Each day, Colton watched, often standing near the barn door, his presence like the wind, constant, inescapable, and indifferent. At first, he spoke little, offering sharp instructions or curt corrections. He pushed her to fill every tub, to prune the orchard, to repair fences that groaned and sagged under the weight of seasons. Margaret obeyed, resentment simmering beneath her skin, but a strange spark of determination ignited within her. She would survive this, she told herself. She would endure. Yet, in these early days, small moments began to flicker in the shadows of harsh labor. Colton sometimes lingered in silence when she finished a task, studying her with a thoughtful gaze. He noticed the way her hands moved with efficiency and grace despite exhaustion, how she persisted even when the sun burned her back. Margaret, wary of any softness, kept her eyes lowered, convinced that vulnerability would only bring cruelty. And beneath it all, a secret she carried burned quietly. Margaret had always been clever, resourceful, and skilled in ways her family did not understand. But that secret, that hidden strength, had yet to reveal itself. For now, she suffered in silence, aware that the world was cruel, her family fickle, and this man, this cowboy, was both her captor and the first person who had truly seen her courage. As night fell, the ranch was quiet except for the soft neigh of horses and the creak of the wind through the eaves. Margaret lay on the hard wooden floor of the guest room, exhausted but awake. She traced the patterns of the ceiling with her eyes and wondered what the next day would bring. Would Colton's stern gaze soften? Would she ever feel safe? Or was this life of labor, submission, and silent endurance all that she had left? Outside, Colton rode the perimeter of the ranch, his eyes sweeping the horizon. He had purchased a woman he did not yet understand, and though he had been harsh at first, there was something about her, a spark of fire, of resilience, that unsettled him. He could not yet admit it, not even to himself, but Margaret had begun to change the rhythm of his life, and in ways he would soon realize profoundly so. The sun had barely risen when Margaret stepped out into the cool air of the ranch. The horizon blushed with pale gold, the first light cutting across the rolling fields and illuminating the rough-hewn barns and paddocks. Her arms ached from the previous day's labor. Her hands bore the stubborn evidence of work, blisters forming, calluses hardening. Yet something inside her had shifted. She was no longer the trembling girl at the auction. She was determined, stubborn, unyielding. Colton appeared at the barn door, his shadow long and stark against the sunlit dust. His boots scuffed the earth as he leaned against the doorway, watching her. "We start with the animals," he said, his voice as firm as ever, but with a trace of something softer, almost imperceptible. "Then the orchard, and by the time the sun is high, the house better shine." Margaret nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. She obeyed, not because she feared him now, but because she had begun to understand the rhythm of the ranch. Horses had to be fed. The earth had to be tilled. Life demanded effort. The morning passed in a blur of sweat and toil. She swept the barn, mucked the stalls, and refilled the water troughs. Her movements, once clumsy with fear and uncertainty, had become fluid and precise. She brushed the horses, talked softly to them, and began to understand the subtle cues in their eyes and ears. One particularly stubborn mare refused to be brushed, tossing her head and kicking the air. Margaret remained calm, her hands gentle but firm, and the horse gradually submitted. Colton watched from the doorway, leaning slightly against a frame, arms crossed. There was a flicker of admiration in his eyes, quick, almost involuntary. By mid-morning, Margaret was in the orchard pruning trees and tending to the young saplings. She knelt in the dirt, hands blackened with soil, the air around her fragrant with fresh leaves and the sweetness of apples. A breeze lifted her hair from her face, and she let herself imagine a different life, one where the sun shone gently and she could walk freely without fear of judgment or auction blocks. It was then that Colton approached, carrying a small bundle of tools. "You're doing it wrong," he said, his tone brisk. She braced herself, expecting another rebuke. But instead of anger, his eyes held a quiet focus. "Let me show you." He knelt beside her, hands rough and large, demonstrating how to trim the branches to encourage stronger growth. Their fingers brushed, a spark of tension igniting between them. Margaret felt heat creep to her cheeks, but held her gaze steady. Colton was silent, patient, and precise, an echo of the land itself. Hours passed. They worked side by side, the silence between them growing less oppressive and more comfortable. Colton occasionally offered small observations, sometimes teasing remarks. "You have a stubborn streak," he said, smirking. Margaret shot him a glare, half playful, half defiant. "It's called survival," she replied. He chuckled softly, a rare sound that seemed almost foreign in the vast quiet of the ranch. The day brought a test neither had expected. A group of rustlers had been spotted near the northern pastures. Colton, tense and alert, gathered his few ranch hands and prepared to defend the livestock. Margaret, despite the fear clutching at her chest, insisted on helping. "I can manage the horses," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor beneath it. The night erupted in dust and chaos. Horses whinnied and pawed the ground. The rustlers' voices carried across the hills like the hiss of dry fire. Margaret, hands steady despite adrenaline, led the horses to safety, closing gates and guiding the frightened animals with a confidence born of instinct and skill. Colton fought nearby, his gun sharp and precise, and when he finally saw Margaret standing strong amidst the chaos, something shifted in his gaze. She was no longer merely the girl he had won at auction. She was a partner, capable and courageous. When the dust settled, the ranch quieted once more. Colton found her sitting atop the fence, legs dangling, staring at the horizon. "You did well," he said simply. Margaret met his eyes, and for the first time, she sensed genuine admiration, not judgment. The days that followed brought quieter, tender moments. Margaret discovered a forgotten corner of the ranch, where wildflowers struggled against the arid soil. She planted them carefully, her fingers gentle yet precise, coaxing life where neglect had once ruled. Colton watched from a distance at first, then approached, his shadow falling across the earth like the first hint of evening. "You've got a touch with the land," he remarked, watching her hands hover over the soil. "Most men would tear this place apart and never care for what grew." Margaret felt a flicker of pride but kept her voice steady. "It takes care of you if you take care of it." There was truth in her words, and Colton seemed to understand. At night, by the hearth of the ranch house, they shared simple meals. Margaret cooked quietly, her movements precise and practiced. Colton watched her from across the table, noting the way her eyes softened when she spoke, the way her hands moved with confidence and purpose. He began to notice more than just her resilience. He noticed her laughter, brief and musical, spilling into the still night. Margaret, meanwhile, continued to hide her secret. Beneath the surface of chores and routine, she carried knowledge her family never valued. She knew herbs, remedies, and techniques that could heal sick animals' wounds, and even tend minor human injuries. Her mind worked, constantly cataloging, observing, preparing for the day her secret might reveal itself. As the days stretched into weeks, the harshness of Colton's initial treatment softened. He still expected hard work and obedience, but small cracks appeared in his stern demeanor. He allowed her to rest for longer hours, offered advice rather than commands, and occasionally lingered, studying her with an intensity she could not read. One evening, as the sun sank low and painted the sky in strokes of crimson and violet, Colton rode alongside Margaret through the paddocks. She had just finished watering the horses, and the soft breeze carried the scent of hay, soil, and wildflowers she had planted. For a moment neither spoke, and the silence was comfortable, charged with a tension neither fully understood. "You're stubborn," Colton said finally, a hint of a smile tugging at his lips. "I'm alive," Margaret replied, returning the smile with defiance and pride. In that instant, something unspoken passed between them. Respect, admiration, and an emerging fondness flickered like firelight. The girl who had been abandoned, gambled, and humiliated was no longer merely surviving. She was making the ranch her own, bending the harshness of the world to her will. And the cowboy who had purchased her for survival found himself slowly, impossibly drawn to her strength. Yet, beneath the surface, her secret waited. It was a fragile thing, poised to change everything once revealed. Margaret sensed that the world was shifting, that the balance of power and affection would soon tilt in ways neither of them could yet imagine. For now, they labored side by side, hearts guarded, each small act of connection a thread weaving their lives ever closer together. The first frost of autumn had arrived, coating the edges of the orchard with a delicate shimmer of white. Margaret moved through the crisp morning air, her hands deep in the soil, tending to the trees with meticulous care. The labor no longer felt like punishment. It was ritual, a testament to her endurance and her claim on this land. Colton rode silently along the fence line, the black stallion's hooves echoing on the frozen ground. His eyes, once hard and guarded, softened whenever they found her. For weeks, she had kept her secret close. The papers hidden beneath her mattress, a faded but legal deed proving ownership of a neighboring plot of land rich with fertile soil and a stream that could irrigate the ranch. Her family had never believed in her capability, dismissing her as fragile, weak, and expendable. Now that hidden knowledge gave her power, a power she had never exercised before. The moment of revelation came sooner than she expected. Colton had been tending to a sick calf, its flanks heaving, its small body trembling in the early morning cold. Margaret knelt beside him, pressing herbs she had carefully dried and mixed for days against the wound. "You know what you're doing," Colton said, his voice tight with concern. His hands hovered, unsure if he should assist or allow her space. Margaret's eyes met his, steady and unwavering. "I've had to survive," she replied softly, "and survive well. I've seen what neglect does. I know how to fix what can be fixed." The calf's breathing eased, its small body relaxing under Margaret's ministrations. Colton felt a swell of awe. For the first time, he saw her not as the abandoned girl he had purchased, but as a force of skill, intelligence, and resilience. Later that afternoon, as Margaret retrieved a set of tools from the barn, Colton confronted her quietly. His gaze was intense, sharp as a knife's edge. "Show me the papers," he demanded. His tone carried no malice, only a hard curiosity. Margaret hesitated for the briefest moment, then retrieved the worn, folded documents hidden beneath her mattress. As she handed them to him, the autumn light caught the edges of the papers, illuminating the seal that proved her claim to the neighboring ranch. Colton's brow furrowed in disbelief. This is yours?" he whispered. Margaret nodded. "They thought I was weak, that I would fail. But I am stronger than they ever imagined." Colton's voice was low, reverent. "I should have known. You've been teaching me that all along, strength in quiet ways, courage in patience." The revelation shifted everything. Margaret was no longer merely a laborer or a prize won at auction. She was a partner, an equal, a woman whose intellect and courage could shape destinies. Colton's admiration now carried something deeper, richer, tinged with awe and desire. Days later, the Thompson family returned to the ranch. They rode in with airs of entitlement, their eyes flicking from the fences to the barn, to Margaret, as if expecting her to grovel. "Margaret," her father began, voice cracking with false concern, "we were wrong. You belong with us. The land, the debts." Colton stepped forward, his presence solid and unwavering. "She belongs here, and she belongs to no one but herself." Margaret's mother faltered, guilt flashing across her face. Her siblings shifted uncomfortably, the weight of shame settling over them. Margaret met their gaze, unflinching, her spine straight and her hand steady. "You gambled me away," she said quietly, the words slicing through the tension like a blade. "You abandoned me. I survived. I worked. I learned. And now I own what you never believed I could." Her words carried the weight of truth, justice, and authority. The family could only bow under the truth, their cruelty exposed, their power gone. Colton's hand brushed against hers, a silent gesture of support and shared triumph. As the afternoon sun dipped low, Colton finally allowed the words he had been holding to escape. "Margaret, I bought a girl at an auction thinking she would bend to my will. I was wrong. You've changed me, taught me more in these weeks than years of solitude ever could. I love you." Margaret's breath caught. She had feared this moment, feared vulnerability, feared giving her heart to a man who had once been her captor. But now, standing on the land she had nurtured, with the man who had come to respect and admire her fully, she allowed herself to hope. I never thought I could trust again," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. "But I trust you, Colton. I've seen the man you are beneath the harsh edges. I love you too." The sun sank below the horizon, casting the ranch in shades of amber and violet. They stood together on the porch, hands entwined, hearts beating in sync with the rhythm of the land around them. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying away the echoes of cruelty, of betrayal, and leaving only the raw, unyielding truth of love and resilience. Life on the ranch shifted. Margaret and Colton worked side by side, a partnership forged in hardship and strengthened by understanding. She tended the orchard with care, taught Colton new techniques for animal husbandry, and guided him with her knowledge of herbs and remedies. He, in turn, respected her decisions, allowed her voice to shape the ranch, and offered steady companionship that no words could fully capture. One morning, as frost kissed the edges of the orchard, they rode out together. Margaret's hair, braided and neat, caught the rising sun, glinting like copper threads. Colton's arm brushed hers occasionally, a touch gentle but possessive, claiming her not as property, but as equal. She laughed softly, the sound ringing clear in the crisp air, and he returned the sound with a smile that warmed more than the sun ever could. Margaret's secret, once a source of fear, had become the cornerstone of a new life. Her family's cruelty had not broken her, it had forged her into someone unstoppable. And Colton, who had arrived expecting obedience, discovered in her a woman who could challenge him, inspire him, and ultimately claim his heart. As night fell, they sat together on the porch, a blanket draped across their shoulders. Stars glittered in the vast, endless sky. The ranch breathed around them, alive, flourishing, and full of promise. Margaret rested her head against Colton's shoulder, their fingers entwined, the land safe, their hearts entwined, and their future uncertain only in the way that all lives were uncertain in the Wild West. But for the first time, Margaret knew one unshakable truth. She had survived the cruelty of the world, found love where she least expected it, and transformed her destiny with her own hands. And Colton, who had once been only a stern cowboy, had found something more profound than gold or land. He had found a woman who could match him in courage, intellect, and heart. The wind whispered over the fields, rustling the orchard and the tall grasses beyond, carrying the quiet triumph of two souls who had fought, endured, and finally claimed what was theirs. The story of an abandoned woman, gambled by her family, had transformed into a tale of resilience, love, and the quiet, unyielding power of the human spirit.